I got to interview Mr. Kyle Cantrell, the program director for Bluegrass Junction on Sirius XM. We talked about what being a program director is like, him interviewing Bill Monroe, and a little bit about American history. Listen on to see what I had to ask. I'm here at the IBMA World of Bluegrass with Mr. Kyle Cantrell. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Lily, and it's nice to be here.
Thank you. So I was first wondering, how did you get involved and get into bluegrass music?
Well, it's kind of a winding path that I was on, to tell you the truth. I started out in the radio business when I was 18 years old at a small radio station, and we played country music. And bluegrass, as you know, is an offshoot of country. It's an outgrowth from it. But my ambition was always to work at WSM and for the Grand Ole Opry. And fortunately, and I got to tell you, Lillian, there was an awful lot of luck involved. But a couple of years later, I was still in college when I got a job at WSM part-time and got to work at that station and get to know some of the big names in country and bluegrass music because so many of them performed on the Grand Ole Opry. I didn't know when I started at WSM how things would turn out. I hoped it would turn out well. I ended up staying there for 21 years, and so over the years got to know a lot of people. When I left WSM, to make a long story short, I did syndicated radio for a little while, but that led to an opportunity to come to XM Satellite Radio to actually program their bluegrass channel. And when that idea was first proposed to me, I thought, this is new. I've programmed country radio, but I've never had to do a full-time bluegrass format, which there's not a lot of that even today on the radio. So it was a challenge for me. And that's really how I got into it. And what I do today is the product of a few years of on-the-job training, as far as bluegrass is concerned, because although I knew a lot of people via my work at WSM, I had to learn enough to be able to fill out a 24-hour format and to make it work, and it's been a great deal of fun to do that.
So what's it like being the program director of Bluegrass Junction?
Well, in my case, I do a certain amount of on-air work. I'm on the air every day and do some special shows besides. I have a weekly show called Track by Track, which is an interview show that highlights an artist's new album generally, and then we do some other random specials from time to time. We're broadcasting the IBMA Awards. The act actually of programming a radio station, of listening to music, deciding what we're going to play, deciding how we're going to play it, managing a small air staff, and trying to get the best out of them while keeping a lot of balls in the air. So
when you're deciding what to put on the radio, what goes through your head?
What really goes through my head and what should be going through my head are two different things. What really goes through my head is what a tremendous responsibility it is, because as I said, there aren't that many stations programming bluegrass full time, and Sirius XM is the station that reaches everywhere. We're nationwide, although we're a subscription satellite radio service. People listen to us all over the country, and I realize that the bluegrass industry and the bluegrass fans are really focused on what we're doing. They really pay attention to Sirius XM's Bluegrass Junction. So it is a tremendous responsibility, and so the decisions I make, I realize are going to affect artists, and they're going to affect the industry, and they're going to affect the fans. So I've had to learn to be focused on what our listeners want and what they like. Bluegrass, as you know, encompasses a lot of different sounds, and to try and determine where the mainstream of bluegrass is something I try to do, and not stray too far from that. That, of course, is subjective, and it's open to criticism. There are a lot of people who think we should be playing more progressive bluegrass. There are a lot of people who think we play way too much of it already, and we need to pull back and be more traditional than we are. Somewhere in the middle is probably the correct answer, and that's where we try to stay.
Definitely. What kind of music do you listen to when you're not working on Bluegrass Junction?
Talk. No, really, sometimes I do get so tired of music that I don't want to hear any kind of music. But I have always been a deep fan of country music, and by country music I'm not talking about what is being called country today and is being played on mainstream country radio. Since I've been out of it, the music has evolved a great deal, and I'm not that big a fan of today's country, although I recognize the talent and everything that goes into it. But, when it comes down to it, give me Hank Williams and give me Ray Price and artists like that I like to listen to. And if I'm just listening recreationally, 95% of the time you're going to hear some kind of classic country coming from my radio.
Okay, so your first interview you ever did was with Bill Monroe. What was that like?
Well, that was my first bluegrass interview. I had done interviews with other artists, but it actually was terrifying, if you want to know the truth, because I had heard people say what a difficult interview Bill Monroe was, because, as you may be aware, he was a man of few words. He really spoke through his music. He didn't talk a whole lot. And I was unprepared for the interview. The guy who had the interview set up, his wife actually was expecting a baby, and she went into labor the afternoon that the interview was scheduled for, and he called me and he said, "Can you fill in for me on this show?" And I said, "Sure, I'll be glad to." And then just before he hung up, he said, "By the way, Bill Monroe's coming by." And then he hung up the phone, and I didn't have a chance to object or make an excuse or tell him to find somebody else or anything. So I did the interview with Bill. But I will say that despite my lack of preparedness and my inexperience, Bill that night put me at ease very greatly, and he was very gracious to me, and we ended up having what I would consider a good time. We were laughing in our interview time and off the air. He was very responsive. He gave me some really good information. I think he recognized where I was coming from, and it turned out really well. And I was very pleased with the way it turned out. And I will also say, from then on, Bill Monroe and I were very friendly with one another. We were good friends. I ended up being an announcer on the Grand Ole Opry after that. I did that for 18 of the 21 years I worked at WSM, and had many, many opportunities to work with Bill, and he was always very kind and very good to work with, and we got along great.
If you could go back in time and give a younger you advice, what would you say?
Well, I would say ask more questions. Ask more questions. Recognize the people you're working around and their experience. Learn from them, because someday they'll be gone. They will either have retired or died or something else, moved on in some way. And you won't have that opportunity again. And there are so many things. My heroes in this business, there are so many things I wish I could have gone back. I wish I could go back today and ask them. I wish I could ask questions of people like Grant Turner, who was a tremendously talented radio announcer and who was my greatest hero in radio broadcasting. There's so many things. Even though we did talk a lot, there's so many things I would have loved to have asked him, because he saw so much of the business. And don't try to show yourself as more than you are, because people recognize where you are in the business, and they'll understand if you're not quite the professional. They know you don't have the experience that they do, and they're willing to help you if you approach them in the right way.
My podcast is called I Had to Ask, and I was wondering, when you interview people, what question do you have to ask?
Boy, that's really good. I don't know if there's any one question I have to ask, but I do know that I want to come away from an interview knowing what their passion is. Why is it that they do what they do? If I'm interviewing a bluegrass artist, for instance, I want to know, why do they play bluegrass? Not just how do they play bluegrass, or how do they learn to play, or what their passions are, their favorite songs are, and things like that. I want to know, why are you doing this? Because really, a lot of people think this is a very glamorous business we're in, and sometimes it can turn out that way, but most of the time, musicians and artists, regardless of the field of music, they work very hard to get to where they are. And I want to know why they go to all that.
So, I know you're into American history, and I was wondering, can you give my listeners a fun fact about American history?
Fun fact about American history. Let me see here. I have read, been reading a number of books here lately that have to do with history, and most of them have focused on the World War II era. And right now I'm working through Doris Kearns Goodwin's book about Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt, a book called No Ordinary Time. Really, really good book. And I am learning some interesting things about why Franklin Roosevelt was the way he was. And one of the things that people don't realize is that he was so evasive and so hard to read sometimes because he grew up that way. He was raised by parents who sort of doted on him, and he was their only son, and so they protected him. His mother wanted to plan his life out and things like that. So he never learned to be just one of the boys in school, and never learned to be direct with people. He always learned that he did what he needed to do to please his mother, so he became very much of a people pleaser as he went along. Now that's a little bit of deep history, but I got to tell you, I found that fascinating, and it's brought me a greater understanding of why he was who he was and why he made some of the decisions he made.
It's definitely very interesting. Is there anything else you'd like to tell my listeners?
If you don't listen to bluegrass music, listen to bluegrass music. A lot of people have this concept that bluegrass is some kind of twangy mountain stuff that they can't relate to, but I will tell you, I don't care what kind of music you listen to, whether it's rock, classical, whatever. I would put the musicians we have in bluegrass music up against any genre of music today in terms of talent. There are some bad ones, as there are in every field of music, but most of them, especially the ones who have risen to great heights, are some of the most talented individuals you'll find. So be sure and give bluegrass music a try.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
So like Kyle said, give bluegrass a try, and maybe even tune into channel 62, Bluegrass Junction on Sirius XM. Thanks for listening to